Okay guys, so once we have completed understanding what are the versions of entity framework we are having, so now we'll be understanding the various development approaches using the entity framework. So basically there are three approaches you can use while you are developing a data-centric application using the entity framework. The first is a database first approach. So what happens in the database first approach? You generate the context and the entities from existing database. So what is the meaning? So here you can see we are having already existing tables. So we will be using this entity framework. Now what I'll be using in the entity framework? Either I'll be using the EDM wizard, which stands for entity data model wizard, or the EF codes. So through this we'll be generating the corresponding context and the entity classes against the tables that we are having in the database. So this goes to my database first approach. Now code first approach. So what is this code first approach for the entity framework? So we use this code first approach when we do not have an existing database for our application. Like say for example, we are having an empty database without tables, but we are having the domain classes. So what we can do, we can use this code first approach of entity framework. So in the code first approach, we start writing our entities, that is the domain classes and context classes, and then the tables in the databases will be generated from these classes using the migration commands. Now developers, so this is the very newest technique guys. So the developers who work with the DDD approach, where DDD principle stands for domain driven design, prefer to begin with coding their domain classes first, and then they generate the database tables. So in this approach, what is the benefit of this approach? The benefit of this approach is that we don't have to over dependent on the backend guys who work with the database or databases, that is the DB guys, to generate a table and send it to us. So we can generate the tables directly in the backend through the domain classes and the migration techniques from the front end itself. And the third is model first approach. So this is not a very popular approach guys in the entity framework development. So when do you take the model first approach? So in this approach, or the model first approach, we basically create the entities, relationships and inheritance hierarchies directly on the Visual Designer. So what is a Visual Designer? So it is a tool that is integrated with the Visual Studio. So once we have the Visual Designer, we generate the entities, the context classes and the database scripts from Visual Model. So when you will be taking this model first approach guys, so if you are very much comfortable with the Visual Designer, you can use this one to create the data centric application using the entity framework. So I have also given you a flow chart so that you can understand when to use what approach. So if you are already having an existing domain class, like say for example you are already having, or you have a project like the project I've shown you on ADO.NET traditional model. So there we are already having all the classes, all the model classes and everything. So if you are having that one, so I can very easily use that particular classes that is present on this ADO.NET, that is the old database concept, and simply I can migrate it to the entity framework to create the tables in the backend. So I can use the code first approach. Now example, if you are having already the database tables, so why should I do this particular process again? So I can use the model first approach, and if I am using a Visual Designer tool, I am comfortable with the Visual Designer tool, I can use this particular model first approach. So it depends upon what you are comfortable with. Either you can use the code first or the data first or the model first. So now we will be going to orient you on the practical about how to use the entity framework. So here we'll be starting with the data first approach. So we'll be creating a data centric application where we'll be displaying the data on a grid. So this is the sample data, or this is the snapshot of the output that we have to generate. So this is a grid. So in this grid, what we'll be having, we'll be displaying the data of the employees and the projects they are in mapped in. So for this work, what we have done, we have, to save our time, we have already generated our two tables, that is the project table and the employee table. So the project table is basically consisting of three fields, that is your project ID, which is the primary key, the project name and the project start date. Whereas in the employee project table, we are having the employee ID, the employee name, the phone number, the project ID and the role. So you can clearly see the relationship between these. And if you think of a practical point of view, what is the type of relationship we are having? So an employee will be mapped to a single project, but a project will be mapped to multiple employees, right? Like you are working on a single project, but like you, multiple developers are too working on that project, right? So we are having basically one-to-many relationship over here. So this is what, or this particular schema diagram, we can see if you open your SQL Server editor, right? So here we are using SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio. So here we can see this particular diagram. So this is another benefit of this entity framework, guys. So when you have used the ADO.NET, you can see, you cannot see this particular schema modeling type diagram while you are using the traditional old ADO.NET framework, right? But when you are using this ADO.NET, or basically if you are using this entity framework, so here you can see this particular schema as well. Schema of what? Not this particular table, but the classes that will be generated, which are known as the domain classes. So you can see the domain classes and the relationship between the classes if I am using the entity framework, which will be very much similar to the schema diagrams that you have seen, or you can see over here in this particular SQL Server Management Studio. So what we are going to do, I am starting with a blank project. I am starting with a blank project. So what is the name of my project? It is the data first approach. So what is the first thing I'll be doing over here? I'll be going to add new item, and here I'll be choosing ADO.NET Entity Data Model. So let me keep this name of the model as project info or project model. And where will this particular domain classes and the context classes get set up in your solution of the project? It will be saved under a folder called app code. So once we have selected this ADO.NET entity model, we open the ADO.NET entity model wizard. So what this window contains? It contains the templates to choose from. Basically it tells us what type of approach you want to take up for designing your data centric application using entity framework. So if you are using the data first approach, you will be using EF Designer from database. If you are using the model approach, I'll be using empty EF Designer model, and if I am using the code first approach, I'll be using the code first from database or empty code from model. So let me generate the next. So the first thing it will require is a connection. So this is again the traditional way you have seen in your ADO.NET, normal ADO.NET, what you have done. So you have clicked on the new connection. So once I click on this new connection, they will be prompting me to give the server name. So server name is what we are having over here. So here my server name is local or the PC name. So here I'm using the Windows authentication. If you are in your machine, if you are using the SQL Server with a SQL authentication, you have to supply the username, you have to supply the password. But here we do not have to means I have not given any type of extra security layer on the SQL Server. So I'm basically using the basic type of authentication, that is the Windows authentication. And here I have to choose the database name. Here it is your ADO-DEMO. Next, what comes, it tells us with what name you want to have a connection variable saved in the web.config file, which will be storing the connection path info. So let me give this name of this connection variable as project context. Click on next. So as I told you that you are having various versions of your entity framework. So if you are using the .NET Core 2.0, so you'll be using EF Core, but here we are using normal .NET. So we'll be choosing either between the entity framework 6.x, or I'll be choosing the older version called entity framework 5.0. so let me choose the entity framework 5.0. So let me choose up the tables to work with in my project. So here are two tables I've chosen. One is the employee project table and second is project TB. So these are the main tables that we are having in the backend, under which we are having some data. I have already pre-filled some data so that we can have the first approach to the project. So these are the data will be showing, or information will be showing on the grid in the front end. So here I have chosen these two tables. A namespace is required so that we can incorporate this particular EDM model under the Visual Studio. So namespace is nothing new to you guys, right? So namespace is basically used to incorporate the classes and everything. So here let me give this name of the namespace as project model. Click on finish. Now once you clicked on the finish, depending upon the machine speed, it will be taking some time to generate your data diagrams, your context classes and the domain classes. So the EDM will be generating here first of all the data diagrams. So what are the data diagrams? It will be basically consisting the class diagram, the properties that is present in the class, the navigation between the two classes, and it will be containing second the domain classes. Domain classes will be containing what? The class, the properties, information and the context class. So we'll be coming to each of the sections one by one. So the first thing that I got is this particular diagram 1 and the name is project model.edmx. So what this particular stuff contains, so as if you look onto the schema diagram that is present on your SQL Server Management Studio and the diagram of your EDMX present on Visual Studio, you can see it is near about the same. But the difference is that here the schema diagram is containing the diagram that is generated from the tables, whereas here the EDMX generates the class diagrams. So here project TB is not the table name but the class name, which is generated parallel to the tables that is present on the database. And these are not the columns but the attributes which are mapped to the columns of the table. And next what we are having? The next we are having the relationship. So this describes the relationship between the two tables. So let me expand this a bit. So here, as I told you, one project is mapped to one employee is mapped to one project, but a project can contain multiple employees. So one to many relationship. Second, what does this particular project model.cs file contains? So it contains the first employee project TB class, which is generated to map with this employee project table present on SQL Server. Next, what we are having the properties which are generated against the columns present on this particular table. Then we are having the project table. So these two steps we are having, and notice this over here. So what I told you, a project is mapped to a single employee, whereas each project is mapped to a collection of employees, right? So this is the navigation we are having. The next comes to project model.context.cs. So what does it contain? The first is the connection information. So it contains the connection variable, right? So where is my connection variable present? If I open the web.config file, so you can see the connection string has been generated with the connection string variable to connect with my database. So this context class first of all contains what? The connection variable. Now the second thing, what does it contain? It contains two DB sets. One to hold records for the employee project class, one to hold informations of the project table class. Am I clear? So what is DB set? It is nothing but a collection, guys, to hold information or records of the employee project TB class and the project TB class. Okay. Now once this particular stuff has been generated, what I'm going to do, I'm going to build the solution so that any changes is updated under your Visual Studio. Visual Studio knows that you are making some changes. So let it update. Okay, the things are updated. Now I'm going to close all of this. Now what I'm going to do, under this particular project I'm adding a new web form and give this name as project info. So here I'm just creating a very simple application, guys. So let me align the document on the center of the page. So the divs I'm keeping under the center. If you want, you can bootstrap, you can add your bootstrap styles and everything over here, but I'm trying to keep it rather simple so that we can focus on the entity framework. So here what I'm going to do, I'm dropping a grid view, and let me give some styles to the grid view. Okay, that's enough. Next thing, what I require some controls to communicate with this ADMX, right? So my basically the entity data model is containing all the domain classes, it is containing the context, so I require some tools to communicate with this particular EDM. So what I'm doing, to do this I can do multiple steps, I can write lines of code, but I want this particular project to be done near about codeless. So what I'm going to do, from this toolbox I'm dropping another control called entity data source control. So what is this entity data source control will be doing? It will be basically communicating with this particular project model.context.cas and the project model.cs and extracting the information from them, and finally we will be doing or data binding the grid view against this entity data source. So first what I'll be going to do, I'll be configuring this entity data source. So connection is what you have kept under this web.config file, that is the connection string variable, entity name. So basically there are two entities over here, right? Entities means the domain classes. So we are having the project TB class and we are having the employee TB class. So let me first of all take the project TB class. And what are these particular entity values we want to show? So we want to display the informations that is stored under the project ID, under the project name, under the project start date. Again I'm telling guys, this is not the table columns, it is basically the attributes of this particular class called project TB, which is mapped to the underlying database table. If I want to automatically generate insert update delete, you can take it out, click on finish. Last is data binding. So what is my data source over here? It will be entity data source. So I've got it. Let me run this application. So it's taking a bit of time, guys, for loading. Okay, so it has loaded and you can see the project ID, you have seen the project name, you have seen the project start date coming to us, right? But I also want the employee informations that are tagged to the project. So what I'm going to do, I'm going back to the ASPX. I'm going to edit column and I'll be going to drop a template field and give this name of the template field as, say for example, employee details. So once we have added an empty template field, now I'll be editing this template field so that it contains the employee informations. So go to edit templates. So this is a blank item template that we are having, under which I'll be dropping this grid view. So this grid view will be containing what? The employee informations against the projects. So what I'm going to do, I'll be going to edit data binding. So which particular field that you want to take out? So I want to take the field called employee project TB. So as I told you, so that is the known as the relationship we are having. So I told you a project will be having multiple employees, so I am connecting the employee informations against each project, right? And here I'll be choosing the custom binding. Click on OK. So that's it for me. End editing template. And finally what I'm going to do, I'll be going to the properties of this entity source control and I'll be including, so now if you see, you are having only one entity, that is the project TB, that is present under this entity data source. But what I want, I also want the employee details to be present under this entity data source. So what I'll be going to include, I'll be going to include this one. So I'll be going to include this particular DB set called employee project DB, which is now holding all the employee informations. So just I'm copying and I'll be pasting over here. Okay, so that's it. Now run this project to check out. So what we are having the project ID, the project name, the project start date and the employees that are mapped against the particular project. But this layout is not looking good, guys. Why I'm telling it is not looking good, because you can see the project ID is getting repeated. So I don't want this type of repetitions to be done. I want to have a control on the particular fields or the columns that I want to display on this particular grid view. So what I can do, I'm going back to my project. I'm going to edit template. So these are the steps we are having, right? So I'm going to edit the template. So I'm going to do something called edit columns, and here I'll be dropping the bound fields. So let me drop the first bound field. So what is the data I want to display from here? So I want to display the data like this: employee name, phone number, and the role. So giving the name as employee name, this is the header text, and data field I want to display the employee name. Again I'm dropping another bound field, so I want to display the phone number, giving this name as mobile number. This is the header text I'm giving. Data field is the phone. Again another bound field I'm adding up, so it will be the role. So I'm giving as job role or designation, whatever you want to give, and data field is the role. So that's it, only 3 columns I want to display. Click on OK. Now here you can see, apart from this, multiple columns are there: column 0, column 1, column 2. Why so? If you go to the properties over here, you can see auto generate columns as set as true, which I want to make as false. So now we are having the proper control of the columns that I want to display on the grid. End editing template. Again rerun the solution. So now what we are having, this is the final display where we are having the project ID, the project name, project start date, employee details containing employee name, mobile number, designation. So that's all about the data first approach, guys. In the next video we'll be showing you how to work with the code first approach.